Good morning, everybody. We're looking at the end of hunting, logging, and independent ranching in the American West, and we're not going to see it happen by government decree. We're going to see it happen by a corporate contract. A few years ago, everybody was yelling about the fact that the UN was going to lock up 30% of all the land by 2030, and then it went silent, at least in the United States. And we thought we won. Well, guess what? We didn't. They just stopped talking to politicians and they started talking to your banker. So the trap has already been laid and the door is about to swing shut. So today I'm going to show you exactly how they're doing this. But before we get into the documents and the details of this, let me set the ground rules. I'm not a corporate lawyer. I'm not a financial advisor. What I am is a guy who refuses to sign away the West without reading the fine print. Everything I'm about to talk to you today is going to be about UN frameworks and banking documents and banking rules. And I am bringing the receipts. But part of being an independent part of being a sovereign steward is thinking for yourself. So I want you to be as skeptical with me as you are with the carbon salesman sitting at your kitchen table. Don't just listen to me. Go out and look at the documents, read them yourself, and consult your own legal counsel before signing anything regarding your land. So I'm here to show you the trap, and it's your job to audit your own operation. So let's get to work. So what do I mean by ending hunting and independent ranching? Well, this all started with something called the 30 by 30. The 30 by 30 is a plan set forward by the UN, which United Nations, and they made this plan. Basically, the goal of this plan is to conserve 30% of the world's land, resources, and water, etc., by 2030. And they get to set the rules of what conserve means. So we're going to get into that at the end here, but I wanted you to understand where this is coming from. This plan that they had, we thought it kind of ended because what they wanted to do initially was set up NACs, which are called natural asset companies, which are like private corporations. It's a special kind of corporation. And then they would transfer all of a specific piece of land's natural resources, called them natural assets, into this corporation. And then they were actually in the process of allowing these companies to sell shares on the New York Stock Exchange. And that's when everybody kind of found out what was going on. If that would have happened, then anybody with a trading app could have just bought basically the rights. They could have purchased the rights to your resources or the resources of somebody's land that was under contract. And that got stopped because it ties up whatever deed it's locked into for 100 years. And everybody's like, well, no, this is a takeover of the West. It's very obvious. So we stopped it. And honestly, I thought it was over. Until recently, I found out that they didn't even slow down. They just shifted to a different tactic, which is selling everything on the private markets. Now, I'm talking about the United States. I don't think that is actually the case around the world because this was implemented into most countries who are members of the UN. The U.S. has opted out of this now, again, under the current administration. We cut ties with, I think it's the Paris Accords or Paris something. That is really what everybody signed. That's a treaty they signed to tie into this 30 by 30 thing. So what are the tactics that they use, though, to tie up the land? Because they're not just buying it outright. Now, sometimes they are. There's companies out there that's their job. They're land trust companies, and they're environmental activist groups that run land trust companies. People invest money with them, and then they go out and buy property and lock it up and conserve it by, putting it back to its natural processes, right? So that there is that, but they can't buy everyone's land, right? And there's two markets here. We have the market of, I would guess, regulatory, so kind of forced market, and then we have the market of voluntary. It all started with selling the fear of climate change. And you might say, oh man, I believe in climate change. It really doesn't matter whether you believe in it or not. This is how they're going to work this. They have to create a financial incentive for the people at the bottom and the people at the top to funnel money through the system to gain the rights to your land. In many cases, they don't even really want the title to your land. They just want to tie to the title. They want to own the mineral rights in a way, but they're not mineral rights. They are nature rights. They are the biodiversity and the actual natural processes, or they call them natural services, in your land. But it's the same kind of thing. They want to own those. So they have to separate them off. That's what the deal is with the NACs. They wanted to separate all those off from the land so they could own those and not pay taxes on your land, just dictate what you did with your land. Now, this affects everyone, not just ranchers or landowners, because in many ways, but because the people that are having their land titles tied up are the people who produce the food for everyone. So when you put the people who are producing your food into a system where they are either a serf lord situation, kind of like what they've done with the hog and chicken market, is very centralized. Like everything is centralized. Everything runs through just a few companies, and you don't really own anything. You just do the work for them, and they tell you what to do. Well, that's their goal, but it's much harder when you're widespread over that much of the world. How do you get this much land tied up? So they use climate change to say that CO2 is a pollutant. This is an essential part of this trap. You have to have that be a pollutant. If CO2 isn't a pollutant gas, then you can't really make this work. So they started out with that. CO2 is the problem, and everything's going to end in 10 years, right? I mean, that was several years ago. It was 20 years ago or whatever, but now it's going to end in 10 years, and I don't even know if it matters anymore. That people don't even care. This is all run through a totally financial system, but they've sold the people on this so that they're okay with it. And when they say conserve, everybody has this vision of like, oh man, it's going to bring this back to a pristine wilderness. Everything's going to go to a wilderness, and I'm going to be able to enjoy it. And the evil rancher is going to be kicked off his land, or have to have wildlife on there. And it sounds fantastic, right? And you're going to save the planet while you're doing it. So they got people thinking like this, and then they make CO2 the pollutant, which means now you can force companies to have a specific amount or only emit a specific amount of pollutant, which is CO2. And in like a document on carboncredits.com, I was just reading this morning, it's talking about emitting chemicals into the, you're just flowing out chemicals into the atmosphere. Now, what they're talking about is CO2 and methane when they say that. So when you classify it as a pollutant, it's the same thing as arsenic, or whatever in any other pollutant. So if it's a pollutant, you can regulate it. So you have the regulated market. To do this, you have to put it into a unit. You have to put CO2 into a unit that you can then regulate. So what is used is 1 ton of carbon. Now they classify that as a certain amount of carbon. A person uses a certain amount of carbon to do this, and a company emits a certain amount of carbon when they do that. They have to create those parameters so they can measure it. And then they have what's called cap and trade, which is like in California, the government issues you credits, like this is where it starts to get financialized. They issue you, here, you can emit this amount of carbon, and they use credits as the amount they can emit. So you can emit 20,000, tons of carbon, which they call credits. So your credit limit is 20,000. Well, if you emit 28,000, or you look like you're going to have to offset that. So now you have to purchase credits, carbon credits, from a different company or somewhere else. So this is the regulatory side. This is the kind of a forced side of doing it. So a company that's doing something that they qualify as low emission, like solar or wind, that company actually has a carbon credit, which is a cap, right? Their cap of carbon credits that they can use for the year are up here, but they only use this many because, of course, the rules are written to where this company, they classify what emits less carbon, okay? in their the documents that they write for this stuff. So these companies that are, let's say their cap is 20,000, but they're only using 10,000, they can then sell their 10,000 extra to a company who's using too much, right? So this starts to begin a financial world of credits. Well, this, of course, opens the eyes of the big corporate giants. They're like, wow, if you're going to actually pay money for this stuff, then that is a financial commodity. We can actually start selling, and we can trade this stuff if we can get it figured out, and hence the NACs come into play. Well, that is the regulatory market, but there's another market, and people love to call this the voluntary market. The voluntary market has to do with carbon offsets. So when I say carbon credits in this, I refer to them as carbon credits, and they kind of refer to them as carbon offset credits, basically. So what they say is, what is stated on many of these carbon-friendly or carbon salesman websites is that the voluntary part, the only people that ever buy these are the companies that they want to look good to the world, because now, I mean, obviously 90% of the world except for the U.S. has signed on to this treaty or set of this plan, right? That they got to conserve all this stuff, and that they're emitting CO2, which is a pollutant. So therefore they want to look better in the eyes of the world. And if you look better, then you can actually, people buy your stuff more. So here's how they do this. They have people produce carbon credits. And they do that by owning land, or at some point they're starting to do this. They're looking into how they're doing this on public land now in a few states, especially Washington and California, because they get paid, right? So if on your land you can prove that you're conserving carbon, which means you're drawing carbon in, you're storing it in the soil, and that would be some ranching practices. They only qualify regenerative ag as that. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But I'm just kind of explaining you the overarching why carbon credits even exist. So they produce that. Well, technically, you as a person who owns land could then sell them to a company who wants to look good. Now, so they buy your credits and put them on their balance sheet, and they're like, yeah, see, I'm offsetting my carbon footprint. Like Microsoft they want to be carbon negative by 2050 is their statement. So to do that, they do the regulatory part. They sell their credits or whatever, and then they buy like a massive amount of voluntary credits so they can look really good to the world, which means to them, they get better loans, they get a interest rate cut from the world banks, they literally, and they're able to trade in countries better than other companies that don't have that. So that's the incentive and what caused this to become a financial thing. Here's the kicker. Carbon credits, and we're going to get into other kinds of credits, but carbon credits don't just pop out of your land and you sell them like a commodity and they're gone. They are tied to the carbon that you're storing. So most carbon credits are no, carbon credits are actually overseen by the banks of carbon credits. So they're not actual financial banks. They're called registries, carbon registries. Now, these registries are the banks that keep track of and verify whether this credit is any good or not. And their standards say that you have to store that carbon in your ground for 100 years to be worth anything. So when a company buys a carbon credit or a carbon offset credit, whatever it is, and puts it on their balance sheet, they have to say, I am now offsetting my footprint because I'm buying a ton of carbon that's been locked in the soil for 100 years. That's kind of the standard, 100 years. So to sell that to a landowner, you have to have them sign a contract that states that when you sell these credits, you have to keep that in the soil for 100 years. That means you can't change your grazing practices that we tell you to do. You can't change anything about your operation. You can't have it burn because then you just lost 5 years of carbon, right? So you can't overgraze it. If you have a drought, you're going to have a problem, right? You're going to have to adjust everything. So there's a couple things that they have to do this. First, you have to sign something that states that you're going to do that, and you locks it up for 100 years. Now, usually you don't sign that. You sign with the middleman, and their contract is not 100 years. And that was tricky for me to figure out. I think I've got this kind of understand what they're doing now. They're signing contracts that are less than 100 years because they can't get anybody to sign 100 year of their, like, here, I'm going to sign this contract, and now I can't do anything with my land other than exactly what you're telling me for 100 years. That's a pretty hard sell to a landowner. So they have now changed those contracts to shorter terms. But that's not how that works exactly. Okay. So bear in mind, it has to be 100 years of carbon or it isn't worth something to the end buyer. Okay. So how did this get into the ranching part? Now, I know, some of you are just recreationists and hunters, and I'm going to get into the end goal of this is to eliminate all human disturbance. And you are counted as human disturbance, whether you're a recreationist, especially a hunter. Any human activities are classified as human disturbance in a lot of this documentation and in the framework that they're setting up for the banks to qualify land. So it's not that you can't get money for credits, but you get more money with certain incentives, right? So where did this all start with the CO2 and the ranching? Because, I was trying to figure out why, if they're trying to get rid, because it looks like you're trying to get rid of cattle. So how did they sell this to the rancher? Well, there is a guy named Savory, and Alan Savory, he has a famous TED Talk. If you go watch it, it's actually really incredible. And I agree with his premise. Now, he's a biologist who believes that the only way we can actually save the planet from climate change is through grazing practices, changing your grazing practices to regenerative grazing practices, to mimic what the wildlife used to do way back when. So this now is what they have I'm sorry. I'm reading some of a comment. It doesn't make sense because it's obviously confused. How deep does it need to be buried in the soil? And should we all just bury ourselves? Yes. I mean, that's the ridiculousness of it because we are emitting CO2. I am right now. Every time I breathe out, there's some CO2. So technically we are emitters of this pollutant. Right. And that's the irony of it. And that's why human disturbance is counted in this. Okay. So it's not how deep. It's like the plants store it in their roots. They store CO2 in their roots. So if you follow Alan Savory's kind of ideal of grazing, which I actually believe in, you can help plants store more carbon in the soil. This is not like, here's the thing with every major problem that you have uh, okay, I'll just say it this way very blatantly. Every lie, every really good lie is wrapped in a truth. And that's how they got this started. They used his idea that regenerative grazing is the only way to really help improve and end desertification was his talk, what that was about. And it was the only way, he stated, that we could save the planet from climate change. So they take this idea that regenerative grazing does benefit the planet, which is true, and it benefits the ecosystem. But where I differ is I don't use that as, hey, let's use that idea. We're going to monitor every single move every person on Earth does to make sure that they comply with exactly how I want to do it and funnel money from them and take control of their land from them in this way up to the globalist elites and the bankers of the world and the hedge funds of the world. That I am completely against. So that's why I'm talking about this. Okay. Hopefully this makes sense. It is super complicated. If you want to get into it, it's not an easy thing. All right. So they've hijacked this TED Talk now made it into a gold mine, because now they can go to the rancher and they sell to him, you know what? You're going to save the planet. We have to have your cattle to sequester carbon in the soil and save this world. So then they can sell it to you to get you to sign the contract that then has you start selling the carbon credits. So this is the way in the door, and we're going to get to the final destination here, hopefully really quickly. But this is not about saving the planet by using the rancher. It is about controlling the resources in the land and the land itself. So how you do this is they've gotten very tricky with the 100-year contract portion of this. Now, when I was talking about this before, I was laying out that carbon credits have to have, even if you sign a 10-year contract with a middleman, you still have to abide by the 100-year rule after the contract is over. And I actually got some carbon companies coming back to me saying, well, you're confusing the market. You're really not telling the truth on that. In fact, there's one rancher that there's a whole bunch of misinformation on here. So I was trying to understand why. Now, he said misinformation, which obviously the carbon companies did not say. They said confusion, because I actually had it right. The basics of that mechanism are actually how it works. A company that buys a carbon credit and the carbon registry companies, the banks, they need that to be a 100-year contract. But they came up with a really tricky thing that they can do some mathematical computations and make it actually work differently. So you can say that 10-year, so let's say you have 10 ton of carbon stored in your soil for 10 years. They're going to lump those together and say that's equal to 1 year, one ton of carbon for 100 years. That's their math. They call it ton-year math. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details here. So if you want to understand how the technical part, and you want to really get into the technical aspects of this and know what to look for in these contracts, go to the High Lonesome Society, which is at highlonsomesociety.com. And that's where I really give the in-depth details of how these companies are presenting this and what I can find in these contracts. I can't actually get my hands on a contract because they won't send it to me. But I really want to know, I really want you, if you really want to understand the nitty-gritty details of how this is done, because that's pretty tricky. They do the math and that works. It kind of devalues the carbon credit, right? Because it's not as longer term, but they just lump them together and sell less credits, basically. But that's not it. That's not all of it, because now they're getting you to sign a 10 to 30-year contract for carbon that's all jumbled together into 100-year contracts. So these contracts actually end at their end date. So they're, because of the computation of math, the carbon seller, the middleman, then comes to you and has you sign a contract for 10 years or 30 years, let's say. And after that period of time, it goes away. It's like the contract is done. You have fulfilled everything. So how would they make any money at this? Because, I won't get into that detail. There's something also called time decay, which actually, as the contract period goes through the contract, like on year 5, you're making half as much. And I'll explain that in the community, how that works. The tricky part and the thing you really have to worry about and look for, in my opinion, is there anything like an evergreen clause or a rolling term or anything like that in the contract. Because let's say you're going to sign a 30-year contract. If they put an evergreen clause, which as far as I can tell, that's like 90% of that, they just put it in there unless you tell them to take it out. The rolling term or the evergreen clause, what it does is it makes it the contract automatically renew every year or at a certain time. So let's say if it renewed every year, year 1, your contract is for 30 years. Year 2, it automatically renews and your contract is still for 30 years. The next year it renews again. Your contract is now still for 30 years. That's perpetual, just so you understand. That never ends. So you would never get out of the contract. If you removed the evergreen clause, which they say you can do, as far as I can tell, you can give them a written thing that says, I want to remove that clause. Then your contract period actually starts on that day. So that means your 30 years starts on that day, even if that's 15 years down the road. So that's how you're getting by the 100-year deal. And they're trying to trap you in these contracts for longer terms. And sometimes perpetual if you never remove that thing. So some of them don't do it every year. Some of them do this in a different way every time you get a check. So every time they test your soil or whatever, then your contract automatically renews. So if you accept the check, boom, your contract just got renewed for whatever the period was automatically. So this is kind of how they're using these things now because they couldn't get anybody to sign the contracts in the first place. So understanding what they're doing with these carbon credits is important because it is creating a financial system, an entire financial system where they can trade and short and bet on and everything. It's like an entire market that is used at the highest levels of elites and banks and hedge funds to trade the carbon. But that carbon is actually tied to your land for whatever period that contract is for. And then if it's a rolling term or an evergreen, you'd never get out of it. And if it's not, then most of the time you're going to end up getting half as much money anyway for halfway down the road. But that's not all, because they have to verify, they must verify that this is actually happening. So the only way you can verify this, so the registries require that verification. They have to have third-party verification. They have to monitor what you're doing on your ranch. So they have to have access. They have to run AI satellite imagery on your place to see how tall the grass is, how much you're eating it down, when you moved your cattle. Then most of them, if not all of them, when you're doing a grazing plan, because this is the first step. Come in, say, hey, we're going to save the planet with your cows. Set up a grazing plan that's regenerative. So you're storing more carbon, right? That's what we're paying you for. But to make sure you're doing that, we're going to test your soil every couple years. We're going to have satellite imagery that documents exactly what's happening to your land. And you must, in most cases anyway, put collars on your cattle that are GPS collars. These collars then, they can read in real time and tell exactly how you're moving your cattle. So this is basically a surveillance, an utter surveillance. Okay, I'm not against the collars. I think they're a great idea. I've seen them work, not when somebody else controls them. So you're paying a middleman company in the cases where they're required, you're paying a middleman company to then access your data all the time that they can use to verify. They can use to verify that you're doing what they told you to do. So basically, somebody else owns the rights to how you're running your cow, how you're doing everything on your land. Now, we're going to get to hunting and stuff in just a minute because that's the first part. Now, so that's how they get you to sign a contract. Okay. And I'm not going into all the details here. Go to highlonesomesociety.com. That's where I'm going to go into the details and answer more questions about them, because every company is a little different. They've figured out a lot of different ways to do these things. But they still are way behind the UN target goals for what they wanted to conserve. So they use the emissions of carbon to make this work, okay? Because they're like, we are really short on our carbon emissions goals. We don't have enough companies offsetting it fast enough to gain control of the land, to conserve the land. I'm sorry, I just said that wrong. So here's the next step. There's something called biodiversity credits that are coming up. They're already here. They're already in the works. Now, I'm not telling you something that isn't here yet. Okay. And that's where the predators come in, like the wolves and the grizzly bears. And that's where your cows leave. And that's where human access stops. But how do you get people to do it? Right? Because now the U.S. has pulled out of any agreement that would force them to force their citizens in their country to abide by these plans and targets and all that by the UN. So they have come up with a task force that is creating a framework right now. And it's mostly, a lot of it's already done. It's implemented and done. They're creating a framework. Now, I already discovered that this task force, it's called the TNFD, is laying out the structure for what the value of a biodiversity credit is, and nature credits, and whether a human is a negative or a cow is a negative, and what's a positive and everything. Then I figured out that this is a framework for banks. So now, any bank that wants to raise their score, sometimes it's referred to as an ESG score. There's other scores now being floated. If they want to raise that, they say, okay, I want to raise my ESG score, for instance. So how do I do that? As a bank, this is a lender, okay, like a huge ag lender. And they then say, okay, you have to abide by the TNFD rules. Now, when they sign on to these rules, they have to audit all the loans that they're making. And if they're making loans that are nature negative, that according to the TNFD rules, then they have to go back and try to fix those loans or change the terms of those loans. Now, almost every rancher or farmer that I know operates on an operating loan every year. They basically don't make enough money. So what they do is they borrow money, they borrow lots of money to operate on the entire year for fuel and fertilizer and seed and labor and everything. And then they pay it back at the end of the year, hopefully, and have a little left. Now, if you run into a bank, if a bank is tied into, I want to raise this score of mine, and now I have to abide by the TNFD, and they tell you to audit your loans, and they look at a loan and find that this person is running cattle according to the TNFD, that is a nature negative. So now, as a nature negative, you can get your loan. we're going to have to use for instances here because they're doing this right now in pilot programs, but I'm not sure exactly how they're doing it. Let's say they come to you and say, well, you're going to double your interest rate, or because you're a nature negative now, you're an impact on the world because you're emitting, CO2 and methane, your cows are, regardless of how you're running them. This forgets all about, regenerative grazing. Then you say, okay, but if you allow like grizzly bears and wolves to be on here, that raises the more grizzly bears and wolves, that raises the nature positive, right? So you're going to get paid more for a nature positive. You're going to be paid less for a nature negative. Cows are nature negative, so you're going to get paid less for the credits that you're getting because you're going to now have to sign a contract with a carbon developer to offset your nature negative to get your loan. So this is the scariest thing I have found yet because they're already starting to implement this. When I was reading the document this morning on carboncredit.com, I believe it was, they said something interesting in there. They asked a question. They're like, if you ask me, first they put that, if you're eating a steak and shrimp, okay, then you're causing, and they put it down in like terms of actual numbers of what you're emitting by doing that. So then they asked the question, so is the shrimp I'm eating, should I have to offset that? And then right after that, they stated, this will already be on labels, and you will be and the consumer will be required to offset what they're causing. So basically, what they're saying in that statement is the plan is to make the producer of whatever it is that they say is a nature negative, and the consumer who eats it has to pay to offset the nature negative that they're causing. So I just wanted to put that out there. You are not out of this. If you're not a rancher or a farmer, it's still your fault if you eat a steak. I'm not really sure what we're supposed to eat other than bugs and lab meat. That's the only thing I can see why that would be involved, because I don't know what we're supposed to eat after that. I'm just seeing that we're going down this road. Now, the biodiversity credits are what are defined. They're part of the framework. So once you get in the door with carbon credit markets, a lot of these companies who sell the carbon credit, who are the middlemen, they're coming in and saying, hey, you don't have to pay anything. You sign these contracts for 10 to 30 years and we're going to take all of it, care of all this for you. Some of these companies are taking the carbon that you are selling them, and some of them actually, one of them that I was looking into this morning, they don't just, when you sign the contract, it doesn't just give them the carbon from your soil. When you sign it, you're actually signing over the rights to the carbon, the water, retention, and the biodiversity. So they're including it right in the contract up front. That is essentially the same thing as an NAC, because then they separate off and you're signing over the rights. Think of a mineral right, right? Now you're signing these rights over to some other company. This company then goes to Wall Street and creates what is it called? A special, I'm going to have to look it up. It's a special something vehicle. Anyway, I'm not sure I can find it right here, but I thought I wrote that down. But anyway, it's a special entity, basically, that you can then have people invest in on Wall Street. So once you sign that contract, even though they say you can get out of it at any time, and all you have to do is pay back 3 years of the credits, the money from the credits. Actually, that is true. whoever you sign the contract with, you're ending the contract with them by paying them 3 years, but you still have all the rights that you sold, and they are not with that company anymore. They're with the special vehicle entity, which is then owned by whoever invested in it on Wall Street, so hedge funds, right? And they are going to come after you if you are in breach of contract, because that ruins the value of the asset that they have in this special vehicle, right? So they can then come after you, put a lien on your land, and if you can't come up with the money to replace the carbon credits, then or biodiversity credits or whatever that you've just destroyed, you're in trouble. They can come after you and sue you and everything. So this is why this is so important. Oh, man. So anyway, that's really the overview. And I know I stumbled around on this because I'm trying to create a picture that goes in one arc, but I kind of didn't. I want to show you that the way in is carbon. The way in is carbon because they have stated that it's a pollutant and forced companies to purchase this thing. So he's forced money into it. Now, the registries make money because every time they verify a credit, they take a cut, of course. And, that's a $400 million a year industry with just one registry. This is like a $500 billion industry a year, and they're talking about $1.2 trillion in assets, in these assets on their balance sheets. So this is not a small deal. And this is the thing. It's very secretive. This is very quiet. This is very quiet. They have to be able to surveil everything on your property to define the value of the biodiversity, like how many animals are on there, how many wolves and how many bears, and how you're running your cattle and all that stuff. They need that data, and then they can use that data to verify the value. But what you're doing is you're handing over the rights. You're lifting the rights basically out of your property and separating them into a separate entity, and then selling them to a different company for an undetermined amount of time, because you don't know how long that 10-year contract is going to last unless you've read it correctly. Here's the problem: is a lot of attorneys won't even know how to read this. They'll just look at it. Yeah, it's a 10-year contract. They don't even understand the principles that we're talking about. And this is on a global scale. So it should be known everywhere, and it's not. All right. So I just wanted to cover that a little bit. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them here. I'll take a couple minutes and answer questions, and I'm going to go. I've been working nonstop this entire week, and I probably should go spend some time with my wife. So, okay. So what is a financial gain that would attract a rancher or livestock owner to sign the contract? Okay. So for carbon credits and biodiversity credits, they're telling you that they're going to pay you for the carbon that you store in the soil. Now, obviously, the middleman takes 30 to 50%. The person that you actually sign the contract with, they take 30 to 50% of the money. So you do the work, and you are surveilled, basically, so to make sure that you're doing all the work right. And then they're going to give you a check for the number of credits that you produce, kind of, because unless you're selling 100-year credits, you're not going to get full value. But they don't really care. They just bundle them all together, give them to the registry to verify, turn them into 100-year credits to sell them on the market to whoever is emitting CO2 in the world, who has to offset their carbon footprint, or they just want to raise their ESG score. So they're the ones that buy, they're the ones that put in the money. The money flows through a couple different people who actually take their massive cut, and then they pay the rancher. So they're selling to the rancher, hey, we're going to give you this money, and all you have to do is the same thing you've always been doing. The problem is you have to be surveilled to do it the way they want. And then, like in the company that I was talking about just a minute ago, when you sign that contract, you're not just signing the carbon over. You're signing the rights to the biodiversity, which then they can add the biodiversity credits, which are triple the value of carbon credits. So yes, you technically would make more money as the rancher if you sold biodiversity credits, but to get top dollar on the biodiversity credits, you have to actually remove the cattle because they're a nature negative, and you can't have any human activity on there. So, because the human activity is also counted as a nature negative. So that is defined by their standards. So that human impact or human disturbance has to be down to a minimum, which is pretty much nothing. And then you get paid the full amount for the So it's not that they're going to say, here, you have to do it this way. It's actually that they're saying you will get paid more if you do it this way. And as it grows, you can imagine if all of your rights are in one of these vehicles that's held by a bunch of people on Wall Street, and they look at it and say, well, this guy's making carbon credits, but he could make way more in biodiversity credits, which would up our value because now they've sold it as equity. They own the equity. So then they're going to squeeze you out of the cattle because this is not a government program. This is all private entities that are making up the rules even. So they can change the rules. They can change the rules to squeeze you out of your cattle. And then we have a private park that nobody can enjoy. And you pay the property taxes and you do all the work and take all the risk as the landowner. Nobody actually can go on there to enjoy it. Hence the 30 by 30. Okay. What if we eat we eat bear meat? Is that a possibility? No. So if you eat anything, if you eat any animal that's taken off of there for hunting, right? Even if it's like a prey animal, as far as I can tell in the TNFD, hunter is called a direct extractor of biomass. So you're removing biomass from the ecosystem that's a negative. If an animal like a wolf kills it, it stays there. So that's called a nature positive. That's a positive out. That's an added benefit. If you kill a wolf or a bear, now you've just destroyed a major part of the biodiversity of the land, which means you drop the value of the assets. So they don't want you anywhere near doing that. So, you got to understand they use the term voluntary market, but they're moving that voluntary market into a way that it is voluntary, but you can't really operate without doing it. Right. I mean, if they make it that way, then it's actually forced, in my opinion. So what we really need is state-run banks and credit unions that are ag specific, that cannot and are not in any way associated with the world banks, because that's how it filters down to the ag world, which affects every single person. So somebody said if a bear eats a person, that's positive. I didn't see that in there, but probably. Yeah, you don't want to mention Wolverines yet. So somebody said Wolverines. One of the things that makes the wolves and the bears more valuable is the fact that they're on the endangered species list, because when you're adding endangered creatures, you're raising the value of your biodiversity. So wolverines are endangered, and we're trying to protect them. Now, anytime an endangered animal hits any ecosystem, it causes massive problems, not just to that animal, but it restricts everything else, everything. And when you have grizzly bears on the land, we got our wolf trapping season cut in half because somebody might accidentally capture the toe of a grizzly bear in a trap. So that is, when you have those endangered creatures on the landscape, they cause so many more regulatory problems than just the animal itself or what they take out. But according to this system, it's actually a positive. So anyway, I'm looking for questions. Somebody said that's absurd and not even necessarily true. I'm not sure what you're talking about there, but so somebody said, what if you put a zoo on your ranch? Is that positive? I don't think so, because then you have human activity. So it's not restrictive. It's what their base score is based on is actually pre-human, which I'm not even sure where they're getting that, because we've had Indians on the land for how many thousands of years? So that is the base score. So anything above that is negative, nature negative. You got to go nature positive. You got to get closer to the baseline. So yeah, I thought, I really thought we could, just don't sign any contracts if you, and I really understand this. Farmers and ranchers are they struggle with making money, so they are always looking for a way to make extra money. And I was like, yeah, man, this could be a way for them to do that. The problem is this is a way to centralize the world. If a very few people at the top own the rights to everything, own the rights to where your food is made, how it's made, when it's made, whether it's made at all, then that's a completely centralized system where I believe that is very fragile, very harmful to humans, very easily manipulated by world powers. So if you are I believe in a decentralized system. The closer we can get to everything that a community needs is produced within 100 miles of them, the more resilient we are. The harder we are to control, and the less fragile all of those systems are. Now, that's in a perfect world that won't happen, because that's really difficult to do. Not everything that we use is going to be made within 100 miles, right? But that is the opposite of this. This is the main global players owning and controlling everything. And they are going to dictate to you through their contracts, and they own the rights to your property, basically, all the nature services to your property. Then that is the opposite of what I would say is freedom too. It's totally against freedom. Oh, okay. So somebody was saying that may not be necessarily true. They were talking about the fact that hunting is not a positive. Hunting is an absolute positive. And here's the problem is we don't get to decide what is nature positive or nature negative. The framework decides. So the people who write the framework in a way to make what they define as nature positive or offsetting or anything like that. They write that down and decide what is good and what is bad. We don't decide that. That's another part of this that doesn't work. So, all right, I'm going to go. You guys have a great week. I know it's a lot of information, and hopefully it makes sense to you. So I forgot to put in there that how the money works, how the money flows to the rancher, but that's really how it gets sold, is like, we're going to pay for you to save the planet, basically. But if they actually knew that they were signing a perpetual contract, if that's the case, would they do that? I don't know. Would they do it if they knew they couldn't get out of it, or if they were forced to buy the collars for their cattle? And then by the end of the contract, the time decay made it so that they're paying more for the collars than they are receiving in a check. I'm not sure. So anyway, that's my thoughts for the day. Until next time, I'm Trinity Vandenaker. God bless.